Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
For months, the Remain side in the referendum campaign has challenged the Leave side to tell us, what does out look like? Spell it out, guys. How exactly will Britain improve on its trading relationships, win friends and influence people if it votes to withdraw from the EU? It's a fair question. We had a bash at it ourselves last Monday. But it is also fair to ask, what does in look like? The EU won't stand still. There is the risk that it could pull us in a direction we don't want to go. And that was the thrust of a speech today by Chris Grayling, one of the leading cabinet members arguing for us to leave. We'll test his argument shortly, but first, here's David Grossman on the debate about life inside.
We are on a journey into the future. The Prime Minister tells us we have a choice to make between the certainty of remaining in the EU and the risk of leaving. The Leave side, though, say the equation is exactly reversed. It is staying inside an uncertain and fast-changing EU that is the biggest risk of all. Chris Grayling, the leader of the House of Commons, was outlining those risks in a speech today. One of the biggest, he says, is that Europe is marching now towards increased integration, and we will have no choice but to follow.
What we have is a new list of EU social policies which will deepen integration across the Eurozone. And these are going to be EU laws passed in the normal way. There's no treaty change, no other option to do so, no other method. There's no way of creating Eurozone-only laws. We have no opt-out. We will be affected.
This deeper integration will happen even faster because of what's going on in the Eurozone.
There has to be a single government structure for the Eurozone. You cannot have a single currency without political union. There has to be a United States of the Eurozone.
A key report by the 5 presidents of the institutions responsible for the euro sets out a vision to complete Europe's economic and monetary union.
That vision calls for economic, fiscal and political union within the Eurozone. But the Remain campaign says that won't affect us as much because we're not in the Euro and have an opt-out.
I don't think the public believes that because we bailed out Ireland, we bailed out Portugal, and despite assurances that we're very similar to the ones we're hearing now, we ended up bailing out Greece as well. I think if you're in the EU, you're on the hook. And that's one of the reasons why the IMF wants us to stay in the EU, because the more rich European countries bailing out the Eurozone, the less they have to get involved.
A further Eurozone crisis, though, could push up the number of migrants coming to Britain from the EU, say Vote Leave. And this will happen even faster if more and poorer countries join. It's government policy right now to support Turkey joining the EU. David Cameron has been very clear on this subject in the past.
I will remain your strongest possible advocate for EU membership and for greater influence at the top table of European diplomacy.
The Remain campaign say, though, this isn't remotely likely.
Now what they seek to do is dog whistle and play the immigration card and make the argument that, look, Turkey's going to be joining the European Union. Look at all these immigrants who are going to be coming here, which conveniently ignores the fact that Turkey is not going to be joining the European Union anytime soon, and the UK has a veto on it joining and taking up EU membership.
However unlikely it may appear today, no one can rule out that Turkey and the 4 other candidates for joining, Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro and Serbia, may end up in the EU one day. Another risk, according to Vote Leave, is an EU army. Jean-Claude Juncker, President of the European Council, said last year such an army would help us to build a common foreign and national security policy and to collectively take on Europe's responsibilities in the world.
The more the EU purports to exert itself militarily, the more it distracts from NATO, which has been the guarantor of military security in Europe since World War II. The EU is notoriously divided when it comes to foreign policy. So I don't think we want the EU pretending, purporting, posturing in the area of foreign policy, which, when it never delivers and it distracts from NATO, which is the real military shield that we have to protect our security in Europe.
The truth, perhaps, is that there's no truly safe road. What voters have to decide is which risks they're prepared to accept and which they would prefer to detour away from.
David Grossman there. Well, we are joined now by Chris Grayling, Leader of the House of Commons for Vote Leave, and by Labour MP Emma Reynolds, a former Shadow Europe Minister, representing Britain Stronger In this evening. Thank you both for coming in. Chris Grayling, in your speech today, it's a slightly long quote, but let me quote it. If we vote to remain in the EU, then it would be EU rules that would determine our minimum wage, EU rules that would say how our pensions work, it would be EU rules to govern our skills system, and even EU rules that would tell us how health services should work. Have you got any evidence that that is how it will be if we vote to remain?
Well, not only that, it is currently on the European Commission website. It's a consultation they are running on a thing called the social pillar. It was presaged in Jean-Claude Juncker's State of the Union speech last year. It's currently being consulted upon. It sets out in detail all of these areas, and it talks about this being a legal document.
Right.
And it talks about this as the
says,
next stage in the integration process of the Eurozone.
And it says for the Eurozone, voluntary for non-Eurozone members, correct? Is it correct that he said that?
That is absolutely correct. It says that. And herein lies the rub, because we have no opt-out from European social legislation, and there is no mechanism for Eurozone-only lawmaking. So unless there is a change to the way the European Union works, and there is no such change on the horizon, these new laws, they may be being presented in the run-up to our referendum as something that only applies to the Eurozone, but there is no mechanism for them not applying to us. There's no opt-out.
So the evidence for the proposition I read out is a statement which explicitly says we will not have to do this.
No, there is no mechanism for us to opt out. If a new piece of social legislation is introduced, we have no opt-out from European social legislation. It all applies to us.
Correct?
Well, this is a totally false premise of your entire speech today, with respect, Chris, because we already have, for example, the banking union, which only affects Eurozone countries. In fact, we have the euro, which only affects Eurozone countries. We've opted to come out, not be in Schengen, the open borders system. So there is a very long history of so-called variable geometry and opt-outs from the UK and other member states, such as Denmark, of many different policy areas. And it seems very odd to me that you should be suggesting that somehow the EU is going to make laws to do with skills, the national minimum wage, or the health service, where there's absolutely no prospect of that. But I think the reason is the risks of leaving, the economic risks of leaving, are so huge and well documented and well evidenced that this is frankly a distraction technique.
Well, I mean, my point is very simple. We have no opt-out from European social legislation. At the moment, every piece of social legislation passed by the European Union, passed through the European institutions, passed by the European Parliament, applies to us.
Sorry.
So where is the opt-out?
Well,
so a piece of legislation...
Grayling, can they not pass a law or a directive or a regulation that says this regulation or directive applies to the Eurozone countries and does not apply to the United Kingdom?
Of course we can.
They
can pass that law, can't they? And then it doesn't cover us, correct?
But they may need to change the treaty, but there is no mechanism.
That's not changing a treaty, that's just passing a law
well, my question
that says this law doesn't apply to the UK, doesn't that?
No, we have no opt-outs. I mean, what David Cameron did not secure...
They can give us an opt-out when they can give us an opt-out on... They can pass a law that doesn't apply to one member state and applies to another.
Well, they could have easily said in the negotiation...
If your country begins with the letter U, you don't have to follow this law.
Well, no, because that would be ruled illegal by the European Court. The treaty is very clear. Social legislation of this kind applies to every European Union member, including the United Kingdom. There is no opt-out. So for all that everybody says in the run-up to the referendum, oh, this won't apply to us, it makes no difference, it will.
This is so important. So Jean-Claude Juncker was just being stupid or disingenuous or doesn't understand the EU, the really basic workings of the EU, when he said this will not apply other than voluntarily to the non-Euro members.
Or alternatively, as we know, the Commission in Brussels is putting various things in the cupboard. It's, for example,
Hang on,
the issue of the Eurozone.
You suggest he knows that this law will apply to us and is just lying when he says it isn't going to apply to us.
I think what the European Commission is doing is playing down what is going to be happening after our referendum. There is no opt-out.
But you're making a very basic constitutional point, and you're implying that Jean-Claude Juncker doesn't understand that point, or is being mendacious in saying that point doesn't...
I think the European Commission is trying very hard not to do anything controversial in the run-up to our referendum. But there is no opt-out from all of this.
Emma Reynolds, it is true that we have, 12 or 13% of the vote, in the Council of Ministers, there are things that the EU can do, not in some areas, but in other areas, that may be voted, may apply to us, whether we like it or not.
Well, it's worth saying that we have a veto in a number of areas, foreign policy being one of them, whether a new member state joins the EU. But what often happens at European Union level, and Chris will know this, in fact, is that very often at Council of Ministers meetings, where a lot of the important decisions are made, there aren't votes because actually these decisions are made very collaboratively and cooperatively. And in 97% of the cases in which there are votes, and there aren't votes that often, we come
87%.
out. 87%. 9 out of 10 cases, we get our own way.
But isn't
Well, we
Chris
say
Grayling...
that, but just on that point, when we have opposed the European Commission in a vote in the European Council, we've never ended up on the winning side.
Right, but it is only 13% of cases where we're on the losing side.
Well, what happens, and I see these cross my desk all the time,
Yeah.
We have negotiated the best deal we still say, well, we don't want to do this, it's not right, it's the best we can get, it's still going to mean £80 million of extra cost for business in the next 5 years. That crosses my desk every week, virtually.
But the wider point on this is that in the modern world, which is interconnected, which is dominated by globalisation, we actually have decided to pool our sovereignty to make us stronger, because many of the challenges that we face that the European Union helps us to tackle, like climate change, cross-border crime and terrorism, the challenges of trade with the rest of the world, we actually are strengthened in our endeavour to do that by being a member of the EU.
I think we understand the geography of the argument you both put. Look, one of the other things, which is the Leave contention, is you're going to have a very lopsided European Union, because you'll have one big country called Eurozone,
Yep.
and then Britain will be a small country
That's right.
at the edge of that'll be outvoted and essentially be a passenger. Can I just ask you briefly, do you accept that that is an unsatisfactory...
No, I don't accept that that is going to happen, because there are 9 member states outside of the Eurozone within the European Union. We're not the only member state, but we are the biggest member state outside the Eurozone. And your party leader, Chris, and the Prime Minister, when he came back in February with his renegotiation, got a guarantee that any decisions that are made about the single market, which affect all 28 member states, we would preserve the integrity of the single market. So anything the Eurozone could do in the future that would affect that, we would have a say over. Now, if we leave the EU, we won't have a say over
Chris
any of the
Grayling.
rules or
So
regulations.
what that gave us is the ability to say to everybody in the Council, we don't like that, please could you discuss it again? It gave us no more power than that. And the whole point about this is that in that document in February, the 9 member states that are not members of the Eurozone, 7 of them, not the United Kingdom and not Denmark, who have exemptions, the other 7 all re-signed up to a commitment to join the Eurozone, to be part of this federation. If that document was worth something, that commitment is there, they have to join.
Right, and incidentally, it does sound rather like Scotland and England, that what you're going to end up with. Is that a particularly dysfunctional form of federation where you have small Scotland and a big England next to it, a lopsided United Kingdom? We rather like the EU with a Britain next to a Eurozone, isn't it?
Well, it's the choice. I mean, the Scottish people voted to stay part of the United Kingdom.
And you wanted them to,
The British
you?
public needs to decide whether to vote to stay part of something that is going to take on the characteristics of a United States. We will be bolted on to an emerging Eurozone federation, a United States of the Eurozone, that will dominate the decision-making. Their decisions will be what matters. Our national interest will be of peripheral importance.
But why talk down our role in the European Union? We have often got our way. In fact, you know, it was the Conservative government in the 1980s that pushed forward the idea of the single market, which has been hugely successful. So the idea that somehow we don't get our way in Europe and that, you know, that we're somehow, you know, a social outcast from Europe is absolutely not true. We're one of the biggest member states and we're very powerful in the European Union.
I'd like to leave that conversation there. Emma Reynolds, thank you very much. Chris Grayling, I wonder if I can just ask you a few other issues while we have you. Tomorrow, your colleagues in the Leave campaign, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, are going to set out some flesh on various policies, but they're apparently going to say they would immediately, if we vote to leave, immediately end the application to UK law of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Is that right? Is that do you understand?
Well, I think that's very important.
Right, immediately. But now, hitherto, your side has said the day we vote to leave, nothing will change. Voting to renounce the European Charter of Fundamental Human Rights would be actually to take us in breach of what are current treaty obligations, wouldn't it?
Well, the Charter of Fundamental Rights has been very clear is not supposed to apply to the United Kingdom.
Right,
it was never supposed to apply to the United Kingdom.
It would be a change in our arrangement with the EU.
Well, it's part of the process of disengagement. Right. I do not want a situation where the European Court of Justice, with a very loosely worded document that is starting to write UK laws in areas like asylum, where they're telling us how we should define an asylum seeker, we should start that process of disengaging very quickly.
I understand you don't want it, but you've got to make your mind up as a campaign. Is something going to change on the day after we leave, or is nothing going to change for 2 years? Because we've had now both those lines coming from your campaign. Because the others might take it as a very serious breach of our commitment to the EU to unilaterally say, without going through any negotiation, we're not going to respect the right of the European Court of Justice to make provision for the Charter of Fundamental Human Rights to apply.
Well, the important thing to say is, of course, the campaign isn't the government. So these are things that the team campaigning for leave believe we should do.
So
they are the things we'll have to be... Well, we can't make commitments for the government. We can say what we think should happen.
So what's the point in saying them if they're just things that you say? So it's not the case, if we vote to leave, that the application to UK law of the Charter
It is the case that the Vote Leave team believe that is what should happen. But of course, we're part of a broader government. It is that government's decision. That's what will have to happen. Vote Leave is not a government. It is a campaign saying this is what we should do.
Right. So we shouldn't listen to tax promises or spending promises, because all of these are just things people are saying.
They are things that we can take back control of.
In your view, do you think it is likely to happen that the day after we vote to leave, and you're a former Lord Chancellor, so you understand these things, do you think Britain would take the step, is it your view, predict Britain would take the step to renounce the right of European judges to preside over us in the way that they currently do?
To start the process of limiting the ability of the European Court of Justice to make new decisions for the United Kingdom as we negotiate our exit is surely sensible.
Right, and is that going to lead to a happy divorce procedure in this case if we vote to leave, or do you think that is going to annoy other nations and actually lead to a rather more gruesomely dark and difficult
Well, I think what the other nations are going to be concerned about, we outside the European Union represent 17% of their exports. So what they're going to want to do is have a sensible, mature discussion about how we continue to collaborate in trade, how we continue to collaborate in terms of security, where they depend on our security services for a lot of the protections they can provide to their citizens.
Yesterday, Liam Fox on the Andrew Marr show brought up the story, the situation of Gibraltar, and said, very important to reiterate, Gibraltar will remain sovereign, whether or not Britain is in the EU. Do you think Spain might be inclined, if we go down the sorts of roads you're talking, to just close the border with Gibraltar?
Well, my view on Gibraltar is that we have to use all of our diplomatic leverage with Spain to make sure that doesn't happen. Right. We had the issue of Spain and Gibraltar long before we joined the European Union.
We're going to be engaging in a very complicated trade negotiation with 28 countries. If Spain says, by the way, we've never liked this Gibraltar situation, we don't like the way you're behaving, we're going to shut the border with Gibraltar, just while we negotiate and talk about this, is that not going to make our life very much more difficult?
They can't legally do that at that point anyway. And the whole point about Gibraltar is we have to work to make sure in our discussions with the Spanish that Gibraltar is properly protected.
But you're quite clear, they can't legally shut the border if we leave the EU.
They can't shut the border the day after we vote to leave, and we have to make sure that in what happens beyond, we protect the interest of Gibraltar and its people.
Chris Grayling, thank you very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it.